Across centuries and borders, one name has been spoken at thresholds where fear ends and truth begins. This is not a tale of comfort. It is the record of a goddess who made people look straight at time. Kali is older than memory. Before her image was painted in red and black, before her name was whispered in midnight temples, there were already stories of a force that could not be contained. In the oldest Sanskrit hymns, she is not the gentle protector or nurturing mother. She is the one who comes in fury. And where she comes, blood is spilled. The earliest records that hint at her rise appear in the Rig Veda, where Kali is not yet a goddess, but a word meaning black, time, the devourer. By the time of the Devi Mahatmya in the Markandeya Purana, around the 5th or 6th century CE, Kali erupts fully formed. She springs from the brow of Durga, the great goddess, during a battle against armies of demons. Clad in tiger skin, with eyes glowing like fire, she drinks the blood of her enemies before it touches the earth, because if it falls, the demons will regenerate. The battlefield is her altar. Her worship begins with violence, not as metaphor, but as necessity. By the 7th century, inscriptions and temple carvings show Kali as more than just a mythic apparition. She had priests, shrines, and followers. But unlike the Vedic sacrifices that were increasingly becoming symbolic, Kali's cult demanded real blood. In villages, goats and buffaloes were slain in her name, their bodies smeared with vermilion and left at her feet. Some traditions insisted that the first offering must always be a black goat, the color of her skin, the embodiment of darkness itself. Why blood? To Kali's devotees, blood was not just life. It was Shakti, divine energy, the raw power that sustains the universe. Where other gods were appeased with flowers or clarified butter poured into fire, Kali drank what pulsed from living veins. It was not seen as cruelty, but as exchange. The living gave life, so the goddess could return protection. Death and nurture were not opposites in her world. They were the same cycle. Ancient Bengal became the epicenter of her worship. The region's rivers flooded and receded, its soil rich but unstable, its people vulnerable to famine, disease, and constant invasion. To them, Kali was not horror, she was truth. Life was fragile, suffering was everywhere, and survival meant facing death without fear. In her worship, villagers found a terrifying kind of honesty, no pretense of peace, no denial of mortality, but in the shadows of that devotion, rituals deepened. Sacrifices were staged not just in daylight festivals, but in secretive midnight ceremonies. Texts like the Kali Purana, composed around the 10th century, prescribe offerings of flesh and blood for her worship. Scholars debate how literally these instructions were followed, but historical records are clear. Animal bloodletting was widespread, and whispers of darker practices, including human sacrifice, traveled in rumor and legend. The act itself was not chaos. It was choreographed, precise. Drums beat in rhythm, conch shells sounded, and the priest's blade was sharpened in full view of the devotees. The animal was bathed, adorned with garlands, its body considered holy the moment it was chosen. At the climax, the throat was cut in a single stroke, the blood caught in bowls, sometimes poured directly on the goddess's image, sometimes smeared across the earth in patterns of red. To outside eyes, it would have seemed savage, but to the participants, this was not cruelty. It was intimacy. They believed the goddess herself descended into the temple at that moment, feeding on the sacrifice, drinking through the blood, turning the chaos of slaughter into the order of cosmic balance. Even the kings gave her offerings. In medieval Bengal and Assam, royal families sponsored Kali worship not only for protection, but for conquest. Armies prayed before her idol, seeking victory in war. Some chronicles describe generals carrying her image into battle, where sacrifices were staged before the march. The blood was proof that their soldiers were fighting not just for land, but for the goddess herself. In these early centuries, the line between devotion and violence blurred completely. Kali's cult was not fringe, it was woven into the very fabric of power, kingship, and survival. And as centuries passed, her rituals grew darker still, whispered in the night, remembered in rumor, recorded in half-burnt manuscripts that spoke of offerings no outsider dared to witness. But the one truth that every devotee repeated was simple: Kali did not want flowers, she wanted blood. If the first centuries of Kali's worship were rooted in village sacrifice and battlefield devotion, the next phase took her into even darker territory. By the early medieval period, Kali was no longer confined to temples and shrines. She became the central figure of Tantra, the esoteric system that sought liberation by breaking fear itself. Tantra was never meant for the faint of heart. Its practitioners rejected the comforts of ordinary religion, where offerings of flowers and hymns promised blessings. Instead, Tantric sought truth through confrontation. If the world was filled with death, decay, and illusion, then the path to freedom lay not in avoiding them, but in facing them head-on. For Kali's worshippers, that meant rituals that seemed terrifying to outsiders, ceremonies held in cremation grounds, offerings of blood and ash, and meditations surrounded by skulls and fire. The Kali Purana, composed around the 10th century CE, describes Kali not only as a battlefield goddess, but also as the dweller in cremation grounds, Smashanavasini. Devotees were instructed to perform rituals in these charnel fields, where bodies burned and jackals prowled. To sit there at night, chanting her mantras amid the smell of smoke and death, was to strip away every layer of human fear. The cremation ground was her home, and to worship her there was to embrace her most fully. Later tantric texts, like the Kaulajnana Nirnaya and the Yogini Tantra, reinforced this image. They linked Kali to practices that deliberately inverted social norms. Wine, meat, and offerings, considered impure in Orthodox Hinduism, became sacred when given to her. Worshippers smeared their bodies with ash from funeral pyres, wore garlands of bones, and carried skull cups filled with liquid offerings. These were not gestures of indulgence, but symbols of fearlessness. To hold a skull was to accept mortality. To drink from it was to dissolve the illusion of separation between life and death. Among these practices, one subject has haunted Kali's history more than any other: human sacrifice, or Narabali. Mentions of it appear in scattered passages of tantric texts and in the records of rulers who claim to have ordered such offerings in Bengal, Assam, and Orissa. Most often, scholars believe these references were symbolic or involved substitutes, clay effigies, flower figures, or animals standing in for human victims. But archaeological evidence and regional history suggest that in rare instances, real lives were taken. Even within tantric circles, such acts were controversial, spoken of in whispers, and condemned by many. Colonial writers would later seize on these fragments, exaggerating them into tales of mass slaughter. In the 19th century, British officials connected Kali to the Thuggee cults, presenting her as the patron of highway murderers. This was propaganda, a way to demonize Indian religion and justify colonial control. Serious historians note that while human sacrifice did occur occasionally in her name, it was never widespread, and the obsession with it in colonial literature was a distortion. Yet the fear of it was part of her power. Even if most worship involved only animals, flowers, and mantras, the possibility of human offering gave Kali an aura of terror that set her apart from all other Hindu deities. She was the goddess who might ask not only for what you owned, but for who you were. At the heart of these rituals lay a philosophy. To Kali's devotees, terror was not an obstacle, but a gateway. The garland of heads she wore represented the cutting away of ego. The skirt of arms symbolized surrendering all human action. Her extended tongue, dripping red, was not cruelty, but truth, the acknowledgement that every life ends, that every illusion is consumed by time. To meditate on her image was to meditate on impermanence itself. This is why her worship thrived not only among tantric ascetics, but also among ordinary people who felt life's fragility. A widow who lost her family to plague might turn to Kali because no other deity acknowledged her grief so directly. A soldier before battle could see in her not a figure of comfort, but one who shared in blood and death. She was the goddess who refused to soften reality. By the 13th and 14th centuries, her iconography grew even more fearsome. Sculptors depicted her not just as fierce, but as overwhelming, dark-skinned, wild-haired, crowned with skulls, with 4 arms holding a sword, a severed head, and gestures of both protection and strength. She was painted with feet planted on corpses, her body smeared with red pigment. Hymns sang of her as Mahakali, the great devourer of all time, who would remain when the universe itself dissolved. For her worshippers, these images were not meant to horrify, but to liberate. To stand before Kali was to look directly into the truth of existence, that life ends, that fear binds, and that freedom lies in surrender. The blood, the ash, the skulls, all were reminders that reality cannot be escaped, only embraced. This was the path of terror, but for her devotees, it was also the path of liberation. By the later medieval and early modern period, Kali's presence was no longer confined to esoteric circles of tantric ascetics or isolated village shrines. She had become a goddess woven into the very fabric of Bengal's culture and devotion. Her worship spread across castes, classes, and communities, evolving into forms that ranged from the intimate and domestic to the grand and public. One of the most significant transformations was the rise of Kali Puja, an annual festival that eventually rivaled Durga Puja in Bengal. While Durga's festival celebrated her triumph as a motherly warrior goddess, Kali Puja took place under the darkest night of the year, during the new moon of Kartik. Unlike Durga, who was adorned with bright saris and offered sweets, Kali was worshipped with offerings that echoed her older associations: red hibiscus flowers, wine, fish, goats, and sometimes even blood sacrifices. To worship Kali on the blackest night was to confront darkness directly, to meet fear not with avoidance, but with devotion. The first literary records of Kali Puja appear in the 15th and 16th centuries, but scholars believe the practice was rooted earlier in village traditions. By this period, kings and landlords began to sponsor grand rituals, raising temporary temples where artisans crafted elaborate idols of the goddess. These idols always carried her defining traits: jet black skin, wild hair, skull crown, garland of heads, skirt of arms, extended tongue, and 4 arms bearing sword, severed head, and protective mudras. But each region added its own flourish. In some places, Kali was shown dancing on the chest of Shiva, who lay calm beneath her, symbolizing both the wildness of her energy and the grounding force of cosmic order. This imagery was not only mythic, but also profoundly theological. In tantric philosophy, Kali represented time itself, the destroyer, not merely of individuals, but of worlds. To show her dancing on Shiva was to show time overpowering pure consciousness. Yet even in that act of domination, Shiva remained unmoved, reminding devotees that beyond the flux of time, there was stillness and liberation. Such images were not intended to scandalize, but to teach. Every life ends, every universe dissolves, yet something beyond remains. As Kali Puja grew, the ritual surrounding it reflected a blending of the terrifying and the celebratory. Families decorated their homes with lamps, while priests in temples conducted midnight rites. In rural areas, animals were sacrificed in her honor, while in urban centers, the practice often shifted to symbolic offerings. What united all these forms was the conviction that Kali was not to be feared from a distance, but welcomed face to face. To light lamps for her during the year's darkest night was to illuminate the shadow of fear itself. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Kali had become the Kula Devata, or family deity, for countless households across Bengal. Mothers prayed to her for protection of their children, farmers for fertile fields, and traders for success in their ventures. This was a profound shift. The goddess, once imagined only in cremation grounds and whispered about in fear, was now embraced as a protector within the household. And yet, her imagery remained unsoftened. She was still jet black, still fierce, still garlanded with heads. For her devotees, there was no contradiction. The very ferocity that made her terrifying was also what made her the strongest guardian. Colonial observers in the 18th and 19th centuries were bewildered by this duality. They saw villagers singing lullabies to their children with Kali's name, even as the same villagers gathered at night for goat sacrifices in her honor. To the British, she seemed a goddess of chaos, worshipped with both tenderness and terror. But to her devotees, this was the very point. She embodied the totality of existence, from the most intimate love to the most violent end. During this same period, new literature and poetry celebrated her power. Saints of the Shakta tradition, such as Ram Prasad Sen in the 18th century, composed devotional songs that described Kali not only as the destroyer, but as the divine mother. For Ram Prasad, her garland of heads and skirt of arms were no longer signs of horror, but of compassion. Each head was an ego cut away, each arm an action surrendered, gifts that freed her children from bondage. His hymns sang of her tongue, not as grotesque, but as the consuming fire of truth. These songs resonated deeply with ordinary Bengalis, who sang them in homes and temples alike. This transformation highlights one of the central paradoxes of Kali's worship. She was both the terrifying devourer and the compassionate mother. For her devotees, these were not opposites, but complements. A mother, after all, is the one who not only nurtures, but also disciplines, who destroys illusions so her children may grow. To see her as cruel was to misunderstand. To see her as truth itself was to be liberated. By the 19th century, this paradox took on new meaning under colonial rule. As the British painted her as a symbol of barbarism, Indian intellectuals reinterpreted her as a national emblem of strength and resistance. In the writings of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and others, Kali was reimagined as Bharat Mata, Mother India herself, fierce yet protective, a goddess whose wild energy could rally a nation against foreign domination. In this way, Kali's worship leapt from the temple into the political sphere. At the same time, reformers such as Ram Mohan Roy and later Swami Vivekananda sought to reinterpret Kali for global audiences. While critical of literal blood sacrifices, they emphasize her symbolic power as the destroyer of ignorance and ego. Vivekananda, in particular, taught Western audiences that Kali's image was not to be dismissed as savage, but understood as profound philosophy, that life is fleeting, that death is real, and that freedom lies in confronting these truths without fear. Through these centuries, Kali remained uniquely Bengal's goddess, feared, loved, misunderstood, and celebrated. Her worship was no longer the province of only tantric circles, nor the whispered fear of villagers, but the public devotion of millions. She had become a paradox embodied, terrifying yet maternal, destructive yet protective, local yet cosmic. And in every form, she remained the one truth no devotee could escape, that time devours all, and liberation comes only through surrender. By the dawn of the 20th century, Kali had crossed yet another threshold. She was no longer only Bengal's goddess, but a symbol that resonated across India and beyond. The paradox of her worship, terrifying yet maternal, destructive yet protective, took on new urgency in a world that was being reshaped by empire, nationalism, and modernity. Kali had entered the modern age, but she had not lost her ancient fire. For Indian nationalists, her fierce image became a rallying cry. In revolutionary pamphlets circulated secretly under British censorship, she appeared wielding her sword not against demons, but against oppressors. Underground groups invoked her name before acts of resistance, believing that her fearsome power shielded them. The colonial authorities, unnerved, monitored Kali temples closely, aware that devotion had blurred into defiance. But even as she became a symbol of rebellion, her worship remained rooted in daily life. In the early 1900s, rural households still offered hibiscus and rice at small clay shrines, whispering her name for protection. Farmers prayed for rain, mothers for the survival of children in an age of famine and disease. Traders invoked her before voyages and transactions. For them, Kali was not politics, but survival, the goddess whose presence infused every corner of existence. This coexistence of the revolutionary and the domestic gave Kali a presence no colonial power could suppress. In one village, she might be Bharat Mata, invoked in fiery speeches. In another, she was simply Ma, a household guardian watching over the night. For devotees, there was no contradiction. Both roles were hers, and both were true. Her influence extended into art and literature of the period. Bengali painters depicted her with modern brushstrokes, but retained her defining traits. Jet black skin, wild hair, tongue extended, 4 arms brandishing sword, and severed head, while offering protection and blessing. Writers described her not only as a goddess of destruction, but as the essence of time itself, the reminder that every empire falls, every crown crumbles, and only the eternal remains. In the cosmopolitan city of Calcutta, Kali's worship adapted to new settings. Wealthy families erected elaborate pavilions, commissioning massive idols for Kali Puja that drew thousands of spectators. The sound of drums, the blaze of lamps, and the crush of crowds transformed the festival into both a religious and a civic spectacle. Yet, in quieter corners of the city, tantric practitioners continued their midnight rituals, offering wine, meat, and ash in secrecy, preserving a thread of the older traditions. The British, confronted by these multiple faces of Kali, remained uneasy. Missionary tracts described her as evidence of dark superstition, while colonial officials feared her imagery as a spark for rebellion. Yet paradoxically, it was through these critiques that her image traveled abroad. Western audiences, encountering her fierce form in illustrated reports and exhibitions, reacted with shock, fascination, or admiration. For some, she was dismissed as grotesque. For others, she became an icon of mystery and power. Swami Vivekananda's lectures in America and Europe reshaped this perception. He presented Kali not as a figure of blood sacrifice, but as philosophy incarnate, the acceptance of death, the destruction of illusion, the mother who frees her children through fear and truth. His words reframed her in terms Western audiences could grasp, aligning her with universal concepts of time, mortality, and liberation. Through him, Kali began to enter global consciousness, not as a demonized idol, but as a profound spiritual symbol. Meanwhile, within Bengal, her worship continued to evolve with the shifting tides of history. As the independence movement gained momentum, some revolutionaries carried amulets of her image into protests, believing her to be their divine protector. Others sang hymns in her name at gatherings, blending devotion with political passion. Kali became both personal and public, the goddess of the hearth and the emblem of resistance. In these years, her paradox only deepened. To outsiders, she was bewildering, a figure who could be sung of as a tender mother and invoked as a destroyer in the same breath. But to her devotees, this duality was precisely her essence. She was time and truth, terror and love, local and cosmic. Every prayer, every sacrifice, every hymn circled back to this inescapable reality, that in Kali, the opposites of existence were reconciled. By the time India edged toward independence, Kali stood as one of the most enduring symbols of the Bengali spirit. Neither colonial condemnation nor reformist reinterpretation had diminished her force. Instead, she had absorbed each new meaning, carrying it alongside the old. To worship her was to stand before the eternal, to acknowledge both death and life, both fear and freedom, both destruction and renewal. And so, at the threshold of modern India, Kali remained what she had always been, the goddess who demanded confrontation with truth, who offered liberation not through escape, but through surrender. By the time independence arrived in 1947, Kali had already been many things to many people. The fierce mother of Bengal, the hidden power of tantric ascetics, the rallying cry of revolutionaries, and the figure of fascination abroad. Yet none of these roles erased the others. They layered instead, building a figure as complex as the land itself. In the newly independent India, Kali worship did not fade. Instead, it expanded into a new kind of public life. Kali Puja, once confined to villages and regional shrines, grew into one of Bengal's largest festivals, rivaling even Durga Puja in grandeur. On the night of the new moon, cities erupted with light. Temporary pavilions rose in neighborhoods, each vying to outshine the other, some with traditional idols, and others experimenting with bold artistic designs. Families decorated homes with strings of lamps. The blackest night transformed into a glowing celebration. The goddess remained terrifying, but also protective. Mothers still whispered her name over sleeping children, while students prayed for strength before exams, and workers sought her blessing before setting out to sea or to factories. Kali had become as domestic as she was cosmic, her image present in humble clay idols on shelves, as much as in towering statues carried on festival processions. Yet even in this modern setting, traces of her older, darker associations persisted. In many rural temples, animal sacrifice continued, the blood of goats and buffaloes staining stone courtyards as drums thundered and conch shells blared. Reformers debated the practice. Some urged its end, pointing to symbolic offerings of pumpkins or coconuts as sufficient. But for many devotees, the spilling of blood was not cruelty, but continuity. The reaffirmation that Kali demanded more than flowers, that she asked for life itself. The debates around her worship mirrored larger tensions in India's own identity. What did it mean to modernize while preserving tradition? Could the fierce goddess of cremation grounds stand alongside the ideal of a secular democratic republic? For her devotees, the question was almost meaningless. She had never been one thing alone. She was always paradox. By the mid-20th century, her imagery also spread beyond Bengal. In Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in Assam, local forms of the goddess merged with Kali's traits, producing regional variations that carried her energy in new directions. Some worshipped her as a village guardian, others as a cosmic mother. In each form, her black skin, wild hair, and protruding tongue remained markers of her identity, signaling the truth she embodied. Destruction and protection intertwined. At the same time, in the diaspora, her presence began to take on new life. Bengali communities in London, New York, and Toronto established Kali temples, carrying her across oceans. Images of her fierce form stood in small suburban shrines and repurposed warehouses, reminding migrants of home and anchoring their identity in unfamiliar lands. For those far away, Kali was both the link to the soil of Bengal and a guardian in the uncertainty of exile. Meanwhile, scholars and seekers outside India also turned toward her. The countercultural movements of the 1960s and 70s, disillusioned with materialism, found fascination in Kali's defiance of norms. Western spiritualists spoke of her as a goddess of transformation, of ego death, of liberation through destruction. Academic studies framed her as an archetype, a Jungian symbol of the shadow, the hidden side of consciousness. In feminist circles, she became an emblem of raw female power, the refusal to be domesticated, the embrace of rage as sacred. Yet this global fascination was not without distortion. Popular culture sometimes stripped her of context, reducing her to a horror figure in films or exotic decoration in New Age art. For devotees, such portrayals were shallow, missing the depth of a goddess who was never merely spectacle, but always the confrontation with truth. The tension between reverence and commodification echoed the older colonial misunderstandings, but also revealed how powerful her image remained. She could not be ignored. Back in India, her worship in Bengal reached even greater heights. Kolkata's annual Kali Puja became not only a religious event, but a civic phenomenon, drawing millions into the city streets. Idols rose taller than houses, carried by cranes into pavilions. Crowds surged for hours to glimpse her face, her tongue painted red, her sword gleaming, her eyes wide and unblinking. Television cameras broadcast the festival live, carrying her image across the nation. And yet, in quieter corners, her older forms endured. In cremation grounds along the Ganges, tantric practitioners still gathered at midnight, offering wine and ash, whispering mantras into the smoke. In rural shrines, blood still stained the stones. The paradox persisted. She was both the festival's glittering centerpiece and the silent goddess of the graveyard. This was, and remains, her power. Other deities could be softened, their sharper edges smoothed into domesticity. Kali resisted this. She was the goddess of what cannot be hidden, of mortality, of rage, of truth without ornament. To stand before her was still to stand before the eternal, the confrontation every soul must one day face. In modern literature, she continued to inspire. Poets evoked her as both terror and mother, philosophers as the essence of time, artists as the uncontainable feminine. In paintings and plays, in films and songs, she returned again and again, not diminished, but renewed. Each generation found in her what it needed and what it feared. By the 21st century, Kali's presence extended far beyond India. Her image appeared in art galleries in Europe, in yoga studios in California, in political murals in South America. Some misused her, others revered her, but all testified to her enduring pull. No longer confined to Bengal, she had become a global icon, misunderstood at times, but never irrelevant. And yet, at her core, she remained unchanged. In the dark night of the new moon, devotees still lit lamps in her name. In the smoke of incense, in the thunder of drums, in the cry of goats, in the hush of whispered prayers, Kali was still present. She was still the black-skinned goddess with wild hair and a protruding tongue, still the bearer of sword and severed head, still the mother whose embrace included terror and love alike. She remained, as she had always been, the goddess who does not allow escape, but demands surrender, the one before whom illusion shatters, and only truth remains. Her story does not end. It returns. Whenever people choose truth over comfort, you may leave the shrine, but she will wait at the next threshold of time.